All right, hello. I'm Ben Dunning. I don't work at Yale. I'm a professor of theology, comparative literature, and women's studies at Fordham University in New York City. Maury and Hindy were kind enough to include me in the smaller conference that took place in 2012 and then asked me to help with the organization of this larger conference. And for this final panel, we are in many ways coming full circle. We are looking at these questions as they bear upon some incredibly current thought in contemporary philosophy of religion and critical theory, but also with an eye to ways in which this conversation looks back to sources from antiquity, and most especially the Apostle Paul, but also other resources in early Christian thought. Our first paper will be from Sarah Hammerschlag. Sarah is Assistant Professor of Religion and Literature at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She is the author of The Figural Jew, University of Chicago Press, 2010. Professor Hammerschlag is at work on another book for University of Chicago Press entitled Sowers and Sages, The Renaissance of Judaism in Post-War Paris. She's also concurrently finishing a manuscript entitled Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Translation of Religion for Columbia University Press. Her paper for today is entitled The Figure of the Jew and the New Universalism.
Doesn't look like a microphone, but I guess it is. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers of the conference, particularly Maurice for the invitation, and also Inessa for all her hard work organizing everything. When Maurice asked me to participate, he asked me to navigate the intricate representations of the Jew in continental philosophy, and with an eye toward connecting what I had to say back to the theme of the resonance of the figure of the Jew in antiquity, I've decided to kind of reverse the paradigm a little bit in my paper, and rather than thinking about the implications for these biblical tropes in continental philosophy, but rather to think about particularly the return of interest in Paul as itself a response to the trope of the Jew in continental philosophy. But this also led me to some kind of uncomfortable conclusions on my part, and I'm going to try to explore this today, which have to do with the relationship between public manifestations and theory. So I'm going to essentially have three stages to my paper. The first is to work out the relationship between public manifestation and the trope of the Jew as I have developed it in my own work, and then to develop the relationship between the return to Paul in theory and its ties to the postmodern trope of the Jew, and then finally to, with some trepidation, consider the relationship between popular manifestations of anti-Semitism and this return to Paul. So, like many of you, I followed the news cycle this summer with dread and distress. Not only were the details and images coming from Gaza horrific, but so were their reverberations around the world. Of course, the recent increase in anti-Semitic violence in France preceded the most recent events in the Middle East, but the war only accelerated and intensified the frequency with which we heard about demonstrations at and around synagogues in France and the mass exit of French Jews to Israel. It is thus with some trepidation that I want to pursue today a topic and a set of questions with which I am not fully comfortable: the connection between mass demonstrations of anti-Semitism in France and the history of the trope of the Jew in French continental philosophy. I certainly do not want to argue for any strict relationship of cause and effect, but only to pursue a correlation that my own work seems to make inevitable. In my recent work on the trope of the Jew in French continental thought, I used the events of May 1968 to substantiate my claim that after World War II, the Jew came to represent in France a figure for exile and deracination, the possibility of a political position that resisted both universalism and particularism, but was the product of both. When street demonstrations were at their height that May and news circulated that the student movement's leader, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, had been prohibited re-entry into France, the crowd of protesters erupted into the cry, "Nous sommes tous des Juifs allemands." We are all German Jews. This illustrated, I argued, a fundamental shift in the status of the trope of the Jew in France. The Jew had come to function as a symbol for the margins. What appeared was not strictly on the model of solidarity, but rather such a cry also functioned to make visible the distance and difference between the students' positions and their claim. The students were not suggesting that they were in the same positions as the German Jew, but were rather disidentifying with their own position as French citizens, and thus highlighting a disjunction and an ideal, one that rejected the political battles of the past by identifying with its negative byproduct. This was a usage of the trope that I saw corroborated in the treatment of the figure of the Jew by contemporary French theorists. In Jean-François Lyotard's book, Heidegger and the Jews, for example, he differentiates the Jews, with quotation marks and without capitalization, from real Jews. In the final pages, Lyotard describes the lot of the Jews, our only lot. It is the only lot of this non-people of survivors, Jews and non-Jews called here the Jews. I saw a similar resonance in Maurice Blanchot's own reading of May 68 as a kind of messianic moment, the negation of patriotism. Quote, the call to go out and into the outside that is neither another world nor what lies behind the world. And finally, in Jacques Derrida's own identification with the Marrano, for whom disavowal was the only form of instantiation, and any claim of identity was ultimately a betrayal, the figure of the Jew was again mobilized to articulate political identity as both irrevocable and unrealizable. The possibility of this confluence in both theory and in public manifestation, the possibility that the Jew could reflect a negation of both universalism and particularism, as they had been traditionally cast in French politics, was itself the consequence of a history of representation, of the very oscillation of the representations of the Jew in French politics between the poles of universalism and particularism. In the 18th century, the Jew was mobilized as a symbol of what Enlightenment and Revolution sought to root out or to rectify. Jews were depicted as backwards, tribal, and resistant to reason. Voltaire, in his philosophical dictionary, described les Juifs as ever unfortunate, ever enslaved, ever revolting. The instantiation of religiosity and all that reason sought to dispel in it. Abbé Grégoire established the Jew as the object of regeneration toward the accomplishment of a France no longer mired in dialects and regional identities. And at the Napoleonic Sanhedrin, the Council of Notables had to defend themselves against the charge that they were indeed a nation within the nation. I'm rehearsing things we all know. Within the space of a century, as Jews moved into the city, entered higher education, and took to the study of philosophy as if it were itself a new religion, their role in France's own political negotiations between right-wing royalism and universalist revolutionary ideals shifted. Jews switched sides and became the object of anti-republican sentiment from the right. Instead of Voltaire's adherents of tribalism, they were dubbed les déracinés by Maurice Barrès in his 1902 tirade, Scenes and Doctrines of Nationalism. Blamed for the secular turn of the Third Republic, they were seen by royalists as the true beneficiaries of the revolution. In 1938, Hubert Bourgain lamented the degeneration of the École Normale Supérieure, the rise of socialism in its corridors, and blamed, quote, its rabbis, Braunschweig, Durkheim, and Henri Baer. This portrayal, of course, is meant not to simplify the complexity of the figure of the Jew, nor to treat its history as monolithic, but only to remind us that the Jew, as figure, has been mobilized publicly throughout France's history to dramatize its political battle. Even Barrès seemed to recognize this when he wrote in Le Figaro in 1890, the crowd always needs, this is a quote, the crowd always needs a word of war to rally itself. It wants some cry of passion that makes abstract ideals tangible. Never has this truth been more evident than at the present hour when the disinherited are weary of programs and even discussions. Juif is only an adjective designating usurers, monopolizers, stockbrokers, all those that abuse money. Unfortunately, Barrès' words ring true once again. Today, when François Hollande is considered weak and ineffective, Sarkozy has been caught up in a corruption scandal, and the National Front has gained significantly in popularity, coming in first recently in elections for the European Parliament, and recent polls even suggest that if the presidential elections were held today, Marine Le Pen would be the frontrunner. January 26th of this year saw the public manifestation of anger towards its weak government with Le Jour de Colère, when thousands joined in a procession between the Place de la Bastille and les Invalides to demand the resignation of Hollande and call for the end of oligarchy. The group responsible for organizing this demonstration, and numerous which followed, resists aligning itself with either the right or the left, and makes that principle primary. Instead, it aims at channeling anger from both sides by merging a set of issues in its agenda. As their manifesto puts it, we demand a radical change and we are supporting the coagulation of all forms of anger. We will take all of these deceptions, this is still a quote, we will take all of these deceptions, these fears, and these frustrations and manifest them as a day of anger. The group's charges include failure of the government to listen to its people, bludgeoning of the taxpayers, starving the poor, paralyzing the army, freeing the delinquents, disorienting our children, perverting our school system, reducing our freedoms, assassinating our identity, and destroying our families. While the organizers claim to resist aligning with one side of the political spectrum, it's clear that most of the 30,000 of its followers on Facebook come from groups on the far right, the Catholic right, the Royalist right, and groups organized around specific right-wing causes, Le Printemps Français, which is against gay marriage, and the Comité Le Pont, organized against the Islamization of Europe. There is among its followers an overt nostalgia for Marshal Pétain and his slogan of work, family, and fatherland. One powerful political force in all this has been the comedian Dieudonné, whose stand-up act has been censored and restricted by the government for its inclusion of a lament over the lack of modern-day gas chambers, the playing of a soundtrack recalling the sound of trains, and his signature quenelle, an inversion of the illegal Nazi salute, which has itself gone viral among his followers. At the Jour de Colère protest, his supporters led a series of anti-Jewish chants, Juif, la France n'est pas à toi, Juif hors de France, and Israel assassin. Given the very claims I made about May 68, is there a way thus, I think, have to ask myself, to think about this Jour de Colère in conjunction with popular trends in French theory? And is there a way to think of it as itself a continuation of the story I found myself telling in my book? One thing is clear, the Jew has remained an emblem to be mobilized toward the incitement of political fervor. And clearly its meaning as emblem has again shifted, even as in certain ways it remains the same. Its consistency is as image of capital and invisible power, and on one level, the revival of Pétain's themes signal a mere replay of one of France's darker moments. But a repetition is always more than a return, and the implementation of these themes is itself a response to the role that the Holocaust has played in France and to its effect in and on the Jewish community. In another recent project, I've been writing about the role of the Shoah in French Jewish identity formation, as well as the community's shifting response to Israel. There's no doubt that the 25 years or so following the war witnessed a call to conscience on the part of the Jewish community in France, a reversal of the majority position on Zionism, a surge in Jewish educational establishments, a rejection of the revolutionary bargain, which reduced Judaism to a confession, and of course an influx of North African Jews along with its Muslim neighbors. Even as the trope of the Jew circulated among theorists in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s as a means to resist communitarianism, the Jewish reality has, in fact, headed in the opposite direction. Emmanuel Levinas is a fascinating case in point in this story, for he is an overshadowing figure for and influence on the trope of the Jew as it developed in French theory, and a dominant figure in the resuscitation of the Jewish community and its integration of North African Jewish populations in the decades following the war. In the history of the trope of the Jew, he's one of the primary reference, though not always named as such. In Meditations on the Jew in Lyotard, Blanchot, and Derrida, in all three of them. Lyotard, for example, borrowed Levinas's formulation of the Jew as, quote, the forgotten of philosophy, paraphrasing Levinas's claim in Beyond the Verse that Judaism is a rupture of the natural and historical, which is always forgotten. Even when Lyotard references Kant in Heidegger and the Jews, it is Kant who is filtered through Levinas, a Kant now read as promoting a subject built on heteronomy. For Blanchot, the reference is often overt, as he put it in his 1968 dedication to Levinas in an essay on Holderlin for the Festschrift for Jean Beaufret, for, quote, for Levinas in an invisible relationship with Judaism. And substantial sections of Writing the Disaster are in dialogue with Levinas. And then there's Derrida, who said in Adieu to Emmanuel Levinas that Levinas calls us to think of a revelation before Sinai and rarely addressed the topic of Judaism, that is, Derrida rarely addressed the topic of Judaism without at least obliquely referencing Levinas. At the same time, Levinas was very much at the center of the post-war Jewish Renaissance that gave birth to the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française. Even today, he's treated as the patron saint, along with René Cassin, of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which itself profoundly changed its mission after the war from spreading the values of France to Jews all over the Mediterranean basin to promoting the cultivation of Jewish education and renewal within France. Levinas himself wrote numerous essays in the years following the war about the necessity of the shift, of the need for Jews to turn inward toward their tradition, their languages, and their sources. He counseled renewed emphasis on Hebrew, but not in order to recover a dead past, but to teach the next generation to speak from the tradition to the modern world. He lamented the renewed exodus of Jews away from Judaism, quote, attracted by assimilation, forgetting the vows of fidelity which we survivors formulated after the liberation. He spoke of the seductions of the modern world and criticized those who failed to learn the language of the Jewish canon. He struggled himself with how to integrate his vision of Judaism as detached from place with the reality of Zionism, but came to embrace Israel as the site in which a prophetic politics could be realized. For Levinas sometimes, and certainly for those who took up the trope of the Jew in response to his work, the tension between the trope and historical reality, between Jewish ideals and a Jewish reality in Israel, could be harnessed productively. In writings that were sometimes critical even of Levinas, Blanchot and Derrida took up that work explicitly. One function of the trope was to insist that the distance between the trope and Jews themselves not be collapsed. As such, it functions as a kind of lever against the self-righteous tendencies within the notion of election and exemplarity. Insofar as the trope was itself oriented around deracination, it could disrupt any claim for propriety, whether by Jews or others claiming now to take up their position. As Derrida himself put it in one of his later meditations on Jewish identity, this is a quote, a long one, "A call of the name worthy of this name must not make room for certitude on the side of the destined one. Whoever thinks he has the certitude of having been him alone, he first called as the best of the class, corrupts and transforms the terrible and decisive experience of the responsibility of election into a dogmatic caricature with the most fearsome consequences, political consequences in particular." Thus, Levinas's work has had a kind of afterlife that made productive use of its tensions by figures who, even when they criticized him, did so out of loyalty to him and to his ideals. But there's another theoretical afterlife to the post-war figure of the Jew, which has used the tension between the ideal and the real to denigrate Jews and Judaism, and to announce a new chapter, which seems predicated on replaying the old theme, such that new political ideals in France are announced over and against a maligned Jewish figure. Given his prominence in post-war history of Judaism in France, it's not surprising, thus, that Levinas is himself at the center of a turn in theory against the Jew and against the postmodern, as though it were itself somehow Jewish. The most prominent culprit in the next chapter of the story is Alain Badiou, who has risen in prominence on the international stage in the last 10 years, and even referred to himself in 2006 as the most translated and widely read living French thinker. Badiou, among others, including Zizek and Jacques Rancière, has fashioned himself as the antidote to postmodern thought, and what he considers rather inaccurately its ethics of recognition. Instead, Badiou considers himself a champion of, quote, the same. His target is identity politics, which he consistently argues is complicit with capitalism, imperialism, and American hegemony. And he sees its philosophical emblem in postmodern philosophy and its championing of the Jew. Levinas is the poster child in this move. This is ironic, given that the relation to the other for Levinas precedes any sort of political identity, and in fact disrupts that kind of adjudication tied to political claims of recognition. Furthermore, in the reception of Levinas by Blanchot, Lyotard, and Derrida, each sought in his own way to use the trope of the Jew as a means of transcending identity politics by figuring the trope of the Jew as one that resists an ontological claim to inhabit its ideal or instantiate its principles. Nonetheless, Badiou marched forward, presenting Levinas's attention to the irreducible difference of the other as that which must be overcome through fidelity to the event. Even as Badiou admitted that Levinas's actual conception of things was at odds with the ethics of recognition associated with identitarian politics, he worked to align the two at the same time that he emphasized the connection between Levinas's ethics and a religiosity that's explicitly Jewish in character. He contended, despite Levinas's phenomenological derivation of his model, that it was Jewish law that provided the basis for Levinas's ethics, and then accused his philosophy of being nothing but veiled piety. In the process, Levinas was staged as the representation of the recalcitrant Jews to Badiou's Pauline Messianism. Neither in his Paul book nor in Ethics did Badiou's target seem to be actual communities of Jews or Judaism, but rather those who speak in the name of specialized identities on the right and the left, those communities demanding recognition, a list which I think he somehow thinks is playfully conceived to include everything from black homosexuals to disabled Serbs and prematurely aged youth. Thus, the Jew became for Badiou the figure for identity politics, even as the trope sought to move beyond it. At the same time, Badiou was writing political tracts that were explicit tirades against actual Jews. In 2005, he published a book in France entitled Circonstance 3, Portée de mots juifs, in which he addressed the tension between what he dubbed virtual, consisting in fact of real Jewish communities in the post-war context, and those he called authentic Jews. So the real Jews were virtual Jews, and the authentic Jews were not actually Jews. The authentic Jew, he argued, was the one who says in the name of all others that there is, this is a quote, that there is no law separating them. He is the one who took it upon himself to break the divisive law and devote humanity to the universal. Models for him began with Paul, but also include Spinoza, Marx, and Freud. Virtual Jews, in contrast, he accused of constituting Jewish identity on what he referred to as the SIT complex, standing for Shoah, Israel, and tradition, and thus cultivating a culture of victimhood to shield Zionism from political critique. Badiou thus traded on the trope of the Jew, but only in order to repeat a history of supersessionism which situated Christianity as the new Israelite. In this version, it was not a matter of questioning the nature of election, but in claiming it firmly against another. More recently, in 2013, he published with Eric Hazan the essay L'Antisémitisme partout aujourd'hui en France, in which he argued for the legitimacy of contemporary anti-Jewish sentiment, insofar as it was in fact criticism of Israel. Rather than trying to disentangle the two, he argued, the Jewish establishment had so tightly woven the two together and so successfully silenced internal critique that anti-Zionists could not be faulted for treating Judaism and Zionism as synonymous. The charge of anti-Semitism, he argued, was a cover for resisting any forces that sought to question the legitimacy of pro-Israel, pro-capitalism, pro-American forces in French politics. Additionally, Badiou has been much more explicit in recent years concerning both how he conceives of politics and the relation between that form and his philosophy. What emerges in all of these texts from the St. Paul book forward is a new form of militancy, one that is all about responding to a call. Truth is its product rather than a criteria by which one judges the justice of one's claim. For the point is enacting change, and the goal is to be a subject of change. Quote, merely believing is not enough to inscribe the event within the world, for the only being of the event is being declared. Depending on his text, Badiou calls his militant fervor by different names, framing it in religious terms in relationship to Paul. Paul's universalism is not dialectical, he writes in the conclusion of St. Paul. It is, quote, a measured advance across a distance relative to perpetually subsisting particularity. Inevitably, of course, the symbol for this particularity is Judaism, those Jewish conformers to the law against which Paul rallied. Badiou has also framed his political project as the next stage of Marxism, calling it recently, quote, the communist hypothesis. But communism is itself defined now in very vague terms. It is, quote, the demand for change for egalitarian justice. It is popular revolt. Cleverly, he defines it in the communist hypothesis against Patanism, which is now associated with those virtual Jews who use the charge of anti-Semitism to protect the status quo. The equivalent of Patanism today, he wrote in an attack on Sarkozy, is, quote, the belief that the French need simply to accept the laws of the US-led world model and all will be well. Thus, along with the trope of the Jew, Badiou has inaugurated the trope of Patin and figured his virtual Jews on its side. So now Jews are associated with Vichy. All of this allows him also to champion the French Revolution. According to his communist hypothesis, the French Revolution was the first wave of communism, and its model of universalism distinctly militant. Even politics itself is defined only in terms of militancy, quote, as collective action organized by certain principles that aims to unfold the consequences of a new possibility which is currently repressed by the dominant order. Politics thus necessitates an attack even on electoral democracy. The electoral process is, for Badiou, distinctly non-political, but rather another strategy in maintaining the status quo. Politics thus would only be some sort of revolutionary action. In all of his redeployment of historical events as symbols, he also, like the organizers of Le Jour de Colère, and here's my connection, expressed the desire to overcome the dichotomy of right and left. Both stand accused. At the same time, though, Badiou, in linking himself up to a Marxian legacy, aligns himself with a leftist history against an economic disparity and for egalitarian justice. That said, it's nonetheless hard to ignore the consonance between Badiou and Le Jour de Colère. I don't want to underplay their differences, but only to point out that it is perhaps through the very return of the Jew on the scene as object of attack by the right and the left that we can begin to see a certain commonality, at least in method, between the new wave of Marxist theorists and the right-wing movements that coalesce around Le Jour de Colère. Badiou has explicitly tried to keep his distance from Dieudonné and his followers, calling that real anti-Semitism as opposed to his own Pauline politics. But what each side seems to have in common is the need for a rallying cry against which to overturn the status quo. and for each, the Jew becomes the symbol of what it thinks against. When Le Jour de Colère announces their goals in terms that seem strongly reminiscent of Badiou's militancy, action, overcoming the status quo, implicit here is also the crystallization of anger, then we can once again declare a consonance between French theory and political manifestation coalescing around the figure of the Jew. One difference between Badiou and Dieudonné, ironically, is that one of them acknowledges and owns the history behind the symbols he mobilizes, and the other does not. The consonance that emerges when we compare the claims of Le Jour de Colère with Badiou's should remind us that even as we are right to condemn those who return to symbols of the past for the express purpose of inciting anger, we should be wary as well of those who try to claim one facet of a tradition without attention to the complexities of reception, the residues of history, and the power of memory. One could say about the recent return to Paul in political theory what Gershom Scholem so aptly said about Hebrew in his letter to Franz Rosenzweig, that one can only walk so long above the silent abyss from which no sound emerges, for it is a volcano. Thank you.
Our next paper is from Ward Blanton. Ward is Reader in Biblical Cultures and European Thought in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Kent. He is the author of Displacing Christian Origins, Philosophy, Secularity, and the New Testament, University of Chicago Press, 2007, and also A Materialism for the Masses, St. Paul and the Philosophy of Undying Life, Columbia University Press, 2014. And with Henk de Vries, he is the editor of Paul and the Philosophers, Fordham University Press, 2013. His paper is entitled, What is an Apparatus? Machineries of Paulinism and the Force of the Name Jew.
Thank you, and it's nice to be back at Yale. I'm grateful to the organizers, but I won't go on. I'll just jump right in terms of time, but I appreciate being here. So what is happening today to the conceptual, social, and political functioning of the name of Paul in relationship to the name Jew in recent philosophical readings of the ancient apostle? A great deal, I think, in more than I can say here, but I want to point out some characteristics we shouldn't miss. I also want to point to a few issues which seem really pressing needs for further research, things without which I feel there is no possibility for effective refiguring of the function of anti-Semitism, which is, I think, constitutive of European discourses on Paul and philosophy, or related European identity and the question of Christian origins. So then, two big questions by way of a kind of retrospective of the past 30 years of European Paulinism within philosophy. And I'll focus in this discussion also on Alain Badiou, also mentioning Giorgio Agamben, trying to keep you all from boredom by saying things perhaps not often said about these two much discussed figures. Generally, I want to discuss how Paul, whom a European and Christian repetition compulsion takes as a placeholder for the topic Christian origins, becomes also a philosophical placeholder for the problem of contingency, technologies of the self, and even a kind of hopeless immanence. First then, Alain Badiou and Paul's rebirth as the subject of contingency. As I try to argue more carefully in A Materialism for the Masses, Paul and the Philosophy of Undying Life, I think that the philosophical turn to Paul is a very important means by which political philosophy is attempting to model cultural transformation, for which it's quite desperate, without the security of any assured philosophical foundationalisms, which is also to say, in lieu of any compelling international political agenda. In the absence of assured origins, causes, or ends, political philosophy has found itself ever more reliant on the category of contingency as that source of our being, our political and social potentials. And as strange as it may sound initially, I want to say that it's the centrality of contingency within contemporary philosophy which is governing the forceful return of Paul within philosophers like Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, and also Simon Critchley, just to name three. To frame the matter somewhat differently, consider that ours is a moment when the most important strands of continental philosophy are being miraculated in ways that call with increasing persistence for a reconfiguration of the contemporary study of religion, philosophy, and technology alike. Miraculation has occurred in recent philosophy as if thought were being drawn, at first imperceptibly, and then with increasing awareness and developing velocity, into vast and as yet only hastily mapped zones whose communicative systems, capacious but nevertheless finite reaches, characteristic tics and traits, seem indistinguishable from an archive of the religious, particularly the imagined legacy of Paul. Given the inflation of what we might designate this miraculating tone adopted by recent philosophy, I believe that miraculation serves now as a much more illuminating signature over the self-distinctions of many contemporary philosophers, otherwise attempting to conjure and enforce in relationship to each other other forms of self-distinction. These self-distinctions, just for a start, hope to separate philosophies of the event, new materialisms, object-oriented ontologies, and speculative realisms, just to tickle your fancy if you're interested in any of those. You see the grandiosity of my initial claim for your consideration. Over all these different sects and schools which define the buzz of the contemporary within continental philosophy, we could, I think, more usefully hang the banner of miraculation. What Hent de Vries has explored in various contexts as a kind of repressed philosophical and religious history of the special effect. With that suggestion in mind, I'll say that in my cheekily entitled book, A Materialism for the Masses, which I'll explain in a moment, I began to put together a recent genealogy of the turn to Paul in philosophy. But you can see why I think much more of the same, the turn to Paul, is on the way. If the miraculation of philosophy is an effective nomination by which to collect all these new movements among the continental philosophers, again, new materialism, philosophies of the event, object-oriented ontologies, speculative realisms, and if the pollinization of philosophy occurs against the backdrop of miraculation, then potentially all of these movements remain susceptible to this same pollinization. I feel that the question of Paul and philosophers is therefore exceedingly important. Indeed, important in ways yet to be recognized, even in the absolute explosion of new work happening on Paul and continental philosophy for ongoing discussions of the future of politics and Jewish identity. We must learn to deal effectively, more effectively than I feel we're capable of dealing at the moment, with the repetition compulsions, if I may say so, endemic to these discussions. And I feel our interdisciplinary capacities to do so are still quite limited. Above all, when we consider that the miraculation of philosophy, its orientation around an elusive special effect, is another name for repetition compulsion itself. Let's stick with the concrete now to make a few things clear. In this book on Pauline materialisms, I tie the turn to Paul to debates in France also, and to a lesser degree, Italy, in the 1960s and 70s about the structure and certainties of scientific knowledge. Debates driven in part by pressing anxieties about whether Marxist critiques of culture could ground themselves in scientific economic categories. As if in answer, the late 60s and 70s saw a burst of new philosophical work oriented around efforts to be faithful to the idea that the academy could provide life with neither fixed origins nor final ends. This orientation yielded a minor explosion of French philosophies of difference and multiplicity, as well as philosophies of the event, also described as philosophies of singularity. Categories which incorporate, just for a start, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze, though I've also been writing recently about Pier Paolo Pasolini and Italian philosophy after Gramsci in this regard, another sort of radically Paulinized area of contemporary continental philosophy. Elizabeth Castelli's beautiful English translation of Pasolini's script for an unmade film about Paul, quite wonderful, is published recently, in case you haven't seen it. In lieu of fixed ends or grounds, each of these philosophers tried to turn thinking toward an engagement with singularity or event-oriented ways of thinking. living as a chance happening, a gamble on a wing and a prayer, so to speak, rather than something that could be guaranteed by earlier epistemologies or assumptions about the governance of stable scientific or logical categories. It was, to use the language of Derrida and Deleuze, the effort to break with logocentrism, a metaphysics of presence, or an ontology of identity which created a need to articulate politically forceful modes of post-foundational political engagement. In this context, the ever-influential Louis Althusser was central to my broader genealogy and the rise of Neapolitanism recently, because Althusser's own work suffered through, we might say, this turn from ground to contingency, or perhaps even better, the turn from stable structure as ground to contingency itself as our only ground. Nice philosophical thought. Echoing the other philosophers just mentioned, Althusser tried to unleash the repressed contingency at the heart of Western philosophical speculation. All these philosophers claimed to be thinking at a crucial turning point in the history of philosophy. And Althusser named this moment the revelation of an underground current of materialism within philosophy. We should note that materialism for Althusser was precisely not a traditional materialism, in the sense that thought and life could be explained by being referred back to some stable, objective material substratum. Such would be, after all, the clunkiest of traditional foundationalisms, and even, he would argue, a further repression of the subversive or underground current of materialism he wanted to unearth. Instead, he argued, we must learn to conceptualize a kind of founding or originary contingency, a kind of accident which itself cannot be controlled by overarching categories of being, identity, or causation. So, the stage was set, and you can see where this is going. Who will be the appropriately motivating exemplar of this effort to rewire Western political philosophy? In fact, only a few years later, one of Althusser's ever-faithful students, Alain Badiou, would find in Althusser's fateful move the real essence of Apollinism that Badiou would also unceasingly praise as harboring the political insight for our time. Transformative moments of political or social life befall us, but also philosophical thinking from the outside. Our thinking and also our political living come to grips awkwardly with what Althusser called the encounter with contingency. The transcendent object, transcendent accident, quite different, becoming philosophy's new and most illustrious muse. And because thought or political life must speak in and through contingency, there is structurally in place a kind of speaking which exists only as a kind of uncertain risk, an act of faith. All our good news, all our kerugmata, being grounded only weakly, hesitatingly. One sees very similar dynamics operating in recent work, also referencing Althusser in the plasticity of being in the excellent writings of Catherine Malabou, or in the fascination with an Althusserian and also Lacanian suture undergirding earlier discussions by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe about the notion of hegemony. Again, I think that the basic structures here, which are motivating the turn to Paul, are quite expansive, and so that we shouldn't mistake the specific references to Paul for something which is actually a much more global transformation of contemporary continental thought. As I try to show in my counter-narrative of Paulinism as a repressed materialism for the masses, obviously making a joke, taking a stab at Nietzsche's reading of 19th century Paulinism as a Platonism for the masses. It wasn't simply that with Badiou in the late 70s and then later in the 90s that Althusserian materialism or contingency fomented a fascination with Paulinism. Althusser's friend, a very interesting philosopher and also a Passionist priest named Stanislas Breton, had already confessed in initially only private letters that his own efforts to create a kind of modern Pauline continental philosophy were basically indistinguishable from what Althusser ended up calling a repressed or underground current of materialism. And while many continue to speak of a recent return of Paulinism within philosophy, we should also note that the struggle for philosophical narrations of 68 echo Sarah, was already deeply involved in different factions' competition to bring themselves, or present themselves, as a more originary Pauline or early Christian movement. Incidentally, it would be interesting to trace this trend backwards into literature concerning the French Revolution, as Sarah was suggesting as well. Someone named Jean-Michel Rey has argued very admirably, for example, that there was a sustained Paulinism of revolutionary discourse that we can trace throughout the 19th century with Edgar Quinet, Jules Michelet, and Victor Hugo as important touchstones there. Everywhere, people wanting revolutions to be Pauline and Paul to be a revolutionary. It's an important backdrop. And of course, the politically significant question for all this whole tradition is why there is this desire, even this repetition, compulsion to associate the two. And moreover, why is it that Paul returns as a Christian rather than, say, as a Jewish thinker of the Revolution, which would be a category that the French scene over that entire period needs, I would say, some education about. At any rate, as for the scripturalization or biblicization of 1968, you may recall that with their book, The Angel, the self-proclaimed new philosophers, Guy Lardreau and Christian Jambet, presented their particular readings of 68 and of beneficial, rather than just scary, dictatorial, or terroristic revolutionary transformations, as a self-presentation of themselves as a new Christian movement, often as a new Pauline movement. You may even recall that Bernard-Henri Lévy immediately named The Angel as the place for a new philosophy to start, one which would not remain beholden to the old intellectual masters, above all the Parisian masters, Lacan, Althusser, and Deleuze. A few years later, in 1976, when Badiou would pen his always very intensive criticisms of The Angel, he would defend his old masters, Althusser and Lacan, by criticizing The Angel's overtly static rendering of Paulinism and Christian origins. Those are Badiou's words. Badiou's is, in fact, an Althusserian and Lacanian critique. In desiring a merely static repetition, or a repetition of the so-called original Christian identity, Lardreau and Jambet repressed the singularity, difference, or unplaceable and unnameable contingency that participates in all vibrant political movements. Subsequently, Badiou would soon begin to press the combat further by penning also a piece of political theater that would press his simultaneously ancient and contemporary political and Paulinist concerns further. A piece only recently translated and published in English called The Incident at Antioch. The Incident is, I think, an effort to win this cultural, political struggle philosophically by making Badiou's own philosophy the authentic repetition of a Pauline moment. A repetition, we might say, in the spirit rather than the letter of Paul's existence. If you haven't read this piece of Badiou's theater and are at all interested either in the philosophy or politics of the recent turn to Paul, I think this play is essential, in part because it clearly deconstructs some of the flat-footed formalisms of Badiou's later book-length treatment of Paul. The play first feminizes Paul and then loses her in a sophisticated comparativism which ruptures all simple identities, refusing ownership, as it were, of a Pauline legacy, which itself remains stranded between 40s Antioch or Corinth, and I mean here simply 40s, 1940s Europe, on the other hand, 1950s China, and emerging displacements of anti-Judaism onto an anti-Islamism of the 1980s Paris banlieue, which I think should remain on our minds for all discussions of the rise of recent anti-Semitism among French discussions. As an aside, one idea for future international collaboration: stage a discussion of anti-Semitism in European universality by way of the play itself. Invite Badiou, Zizek, some others who'd be interested, and then refuse to allow the anachronistic play of legacies and identities in this play to be fixed into the very problematic tale of European universalism that, as I will explain, I find to be endemic to Badiou and Zizek's collapsing of a Christian origin story onto the formal categories of universal versus particular. In a word, stage a discussion of Paulinism whereby Paul remains Jewish rather than becoming the first Christian. It would be an evolution in the discussions, and it would, and it was this type of Paul I was trying to teach philosophers how to read in my rhetorical and political skewering of early Christian efforts to co-opt Paul as precisely a founder of Christianity, rather than praising him as one of the multitude of creative Jewish partisans. So I just want to underwrite also Josh Burns' intervention, which seems quite significant to me. That said, I think we should acknowledge that there's a great deal of work yet to be done to clarify the respective biblicisms or scripturalizations of French political theory since 1968. So much is being contested, say, in the different Paulinisms or different early Christianities being proposed by Badiou or the new philosophers. For example, we must not forget either that Badiou's Paula, in the incident at Antioch, carries some of Badiou's finest career-making attacks against Foucauldian historicism, read in this play, a politics which remains stuck in the past, stuck in uncreative repetition. Gilles Deleuze's Stoic fascination with the one-all as a philosophical category, read in this play, a category which, as Paula describes at some length, becomes obsessed with the unspeakable or mystical. And finally, a critique of the dissemination of philosophical multiplicity, which he identifies with Derrida, which in this play becomes a kind of mournful politics incapable of founding a new political movement, always ever waiting for something to happen. Similarly, we could also mention at this time in France the contest between Claude Lefort's theologizing of the political, for example, his permanency of the theologico-political, as being strictly opposed by Cornelius Castoriadis' counteraction of the theologizing of politics by references to early Greek models. Michel Foucault's odd placement of the biblical and later the Christian in relation to the Greeks is similarly oriented around these larger philosophical and political struggles. In the late 70s and 80s, in other words, there was a great deal of struggle about where to file, we might say, political and biblical tropes in relation to each other. And if I may say so, a lot of work remains to be done, even just on the French philosophical scene, in order to get even this level of retrospective insight about the question of anti-Semitism in order to better chart where it might be going, say, in Paris, where a great deal is happening now, but also how this trajectory differs, say, from what is happening in Rome, London, or New York. And a great deal could be said. I'd love to. I think it'd be a useful future project collaboratively. But it should go without saying, and it's usually not, that what is happening now, philosophically, politically, and culturally, with the gesture toward Paul in France, Britain, or Italy, or the US, are absolutely not the same thing. At any rate, as I read it, the turn to Paul is very simply a transparent crystallization of a recent philosophical genealogy in France, just for a start, which was entirely absorbed by and oriented around a kind of Jewish question, which is indistinguishable from the question of how one places Christian origins, or the biblical, in relation to ongoing philosophical and political desire. I want to say also that it is imperative that the interdisciplinary ideas, topics, or discursive regimes we are considering hit on the effective modes of reconfiguring these earlier forms of debate. Otherwise, I fear, the repetition compulsions I've tried to analyze in a materialism for the masses will not only continue, but in fact dramatically expand as continental philosophy continues to miraculate itself. So a few concluding thoughts about Badiou's Paul. Badiou has at least two very different Pauls. His theatrical figure of Paula being in some ways much more comparative, textured, and provocative than the rather mathematized, formalized Paul in his later St. Paul. And while those who know me know I'm reluctant to say it, I think it's clear that Badiou's hyper-Lutheran reading of the Paul in the St. Paul book has clearly had a stupefying effect on his capacities to say important things, as he is constantly invited to do, about the question of contemporary Jewish identities, which he often elides unhelpfully into questions about Israeli-Palestinian politics. Already in the subtitle of Badiou's Paul book, there is a fall into some of the simplest traps of modern European, and I would, echoing Burns again, say early Christian repetitions, compulsions around the name Paul. The subtitle of the book, after all, is St. Paul, Foundation of Universalism. Ouch. As Badiou's pronouncements since the publication of this book make clear, the force of this repetition compulsion is all the more evident when the entire point of his Paulinism in that book, in his political theater, and in his constant self-referencing as a kind of Paul figure, is that there are no universals, that there are no foundations of any traditional sort, but that all such categories, all such political processes must be invented as if pulled like a rabbit out of a hat from nothingness itself. Nevertheless, with a subtitle like that, before the book is ever opened, Badiou's Paulinism presents itself as yet another purveyor of a flat-footed European universalism which misrecognizes itself as something generic or general, even as everyone else appears as problematically particular. The situation only gets worse when Badiou builds his Paul from out of the Bultmannian scholar Gunther Borenkamp and the equally Bultmannian Stanislas Breton. So, invariably, Paul becomes a kind of last Jewish, first Christian figure, Paulinism as neither Jew nor Greek, and in fact outdoing them both for contemporary political relevance. Greeks are stuck in cosmological holisms, totalities, read logocentrisms, metaphysics of presence and identity. But even worse, Paul's Jews are indices of contemporary identity politics. By the same token, I don't think I need to add that rhetorically, socially, and politically, the name Greek in this allegedly Pauline polemic does not at all naturally attach to an empirical audience of Badiou's at all in the same way that the word Jews, in fact, does. It's Badiou's fault, and he should have known better. But that book, contrary to many of his own points, sets itself up for the worst kinds of scriptedness in relationship to nasty Parisian debates about, say, French Jewish identity in relation to the state and securitization of Israel. As I read it, perhaps we could return to this, Badiou has spent most of his time explaining how his post-Althuserian Paulinism, that is to say, he spent a lot of time since the publication of that book, and I think this is important to say, he spent a lot of his time explaining how his own post-Althuserian Paulinism is actually not what his Paulinism sometimes seems to be, namely a clunky foundationalism of the universal, which necessarily looks at particular identity, Jewish identity above all, as an obstruction needing to be sacrificed or disavowed for the sake of the universal. In the St. Paul book, Badiou was just too naive about the historical force of a paradigmatic anti-Semitism which rooted itself in descriptions of Paul in relation to Christian origins above all. I have an entire section about apparatus and Agamben, and it's even bleaker. But I want to make sure that I don't go over time, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. Thank you.
J. Cameron Carter is Associate Professor of Theology at Duke University Divinity School. He does research at the intersection of religious and theological studies, critical theory, and Black studies. He's been a fellow at the National Humanities Center and has been the recipient of several research awards. His first book is Race, a Theological Account, Oxford University Press, 2008. In it, he explored the connections between modern racial theories generally and anti-Blackness particularly, and Christian supersessionism. Further still, the book argues that the emergence of Black religious and theological studies emerged precisely as a research program intent on understanding this problem and construct lines of flight from the eminence of the racial Christian imaginary itself. He is editor of and contributor to the collection of essays titled Religion and the Futures of Blackness, He's currently finishing a book on the political theology of sovereignty and black critical thought, or what he calls in the book, the theory and practice of insovereignty. The working title of the book, which is contracted with Yale University Press, is The Color of Sovereignty, A Fugitive History of Political Theology. His talk today is entitled Insovereignty in Palestine, Negritude and the Reproductions of Colonialism.
Good evening, everyone. Quick word of gratitude to the conveners of this conference and organizers. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and as well, a word of gratitude for my colleagues on this final panel of the evening. I too want to jump right in. I fear that I probably have too much here, so at the end I may start to just summarize things, and let's see how it goes. The title is Insovereignty in Palestine, Negritude and the Reproductions of Colonialism, or an argument in 3 stanzas and without a conclusion. The first movement of this presentation is called Insovereign Blackness. What does Aimé Césaire's concept of negritude, a neologism that's roughly translated as blackness, have to do with the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And not just the current conflict, but what does negritude have to do with the now half-century post-World War II, post-Auschwitz long conflict in this part or that part of the world? And how, by way of this conflict, illuminated through or looked at through negritude, shed light on modernity as a certain kind of spatial arrangement? How might it complexify our understanding of racism generally and anti-Semitism more specifically in this, the time of a supposed post-racial era, or what I've taken to calling an era of the post-racial blues? The task I've set myself this afternoon at this important, and it goes without saying, given the latest offensive over the summer, incursions into Gaza and whatnot, this timely conference of intellectual exchange is to address, or more humbly, if I can put it this way, make an approach towards answering some of these questions. I must admit up front that I do not come at this topic as a clean slate, and if the truth be told, you don't either. I come at this topic in solidarity, to put my own cards on the table, as it were, with Palestinians. But that solidarity, I want to make clear, is anchored in the fact that I'm against anti-Semitism, and as one of the most heinous expressions of racism that the modern world has ever produced. Or put differently, because I'm against sovereignty, I'm also, and here's something I'm trying to develop in this talk, I'm also against a 2-state solution. Because I'm against anti-Semitism, I want to argue towards the structures of a 1-state solution. And as I'm already on the record in prior publications in saying as much, I'll just simply reiterate it here, as it's an important piece of the argument that I'm hoping to unravel in elaborating this talk. Namely, that the modern world is born of a fatal Christian mistake whose roots go back to the beginnings of modern capitalism and the Atlantic colonial slave system. That is, it goes back to the era of the modern spatial nexus between Europe, the American hemisphere, and the African subcontinent. It was a form of Christian supersessionism that is the backdrop against which the modern colonial world, as Walter Mignolo has put it, or the house that race built, as Wanima Lubiano puts it, came into being. In the transition from a period that has come to be called the Middle Ages, I only go with this periodization because it's become convention, though it's problematic convention, to an era now demarcated as modernity. And parenthetically, again, I've taken to calling our moment a medieval modernity. a strictly Christian theological supersessionism, the difference between Jews, Muslims, and Christians being a theological difference, transubstantiated into blood difference. I'm thinking of the Iberian Limpieza de Sangre laws of blood, which made religious conversion subordinate to genealogy, to lineage, to bios. That is strictly theological supersessionism, transubstantiated into the beginnings of a scientific biological supersessionism. And on the basis of bios, or life itself, difference was established as a process of what can now be called racism. With this transubstantiation in place, the discursive terms were set, woven inside of a Christian imaginary, wherein an entire taxonomic logic of race could emerge to establish practices of difference that would fuel a Portuguese project of expropriation of African peoples in the mid-15th century from the African subcontinent to begin the Atlantic chattel slave trade based on what we now call race. Such is the beginning of a practice of racism funded by an incipient, yet to be articulated, theory of race. It would take time before the word race itself, and longer time still for the concept of racism as words to emerge in the modern lexicon, though clearly the theory and practice of these terms precede their lexical invention. Moreover, these same discursive terms of race/ism would be deployed by the Spanish to fund the processes of early modern colonialism and settler colonization, and to extend the Atlantic chattel slavery operation begun by the Portuguese now into the Antilles. They will be joined by other, that is, the Spanish and the Portuguese, will be joined by other European nations to extend both colonialism, settler colonialism, and other forms of dispossession across the Atlantic hemisphere. In all of this, slavery and colonialism, settler colonialism, are themselves or prove to be themselves practices of accumulation and disaccumulation, or AKA dispossession, practices of value and alienation. In short, what I'm drawing attention to is the link between Christian supersessionism in the early modern moment, the forging of the modern world through an imagination of the human, and the incipient globalization of capital. A world or a house was built on top of the earth. I'm describing the house that race built. This is a house, a world in which contact was refused, cultural intimacies rejected, in favor of what theorist Naomi Chandler, whose annotations on W.E.B. Du Bois has forever changed both our engagements with Du Bois and with questions of race and globality, what Chandler has called projects of purity and ontologies of pure being. Out of a transubstantiated Christian supersessionism, which has within it the beginning conditions of what we call now anti-Semitism, as itself split between anti-Jewishness and anti-Muslim Islamophobia, out of a transubstantiated Christian supersessionism that has globally extended itself by the vehicles of capital and militarism and missionary conquest, the properly human, as it has been tied to human property, was born. But let's linger in the cut for a moment still on the issue of the discursivity of Christian supersessionism in its production of anti-Semitism, if we can push that language back to the 15th century, to fund a new antagonistic political formation, the name of which is a character, the figure called the human. In the constitution of the biopolitical, or what I've just been describing, the theopolitical did not cease doing its work, or perhaps in continuity with Gil Anijar's most recent work, theologically or religiously based blood work in the making of homogeneous, pure communities on the one hand, and biologically based blood work in the making of homogeneous, pure communities on the other, must be understood as linked to each other. By this, I mean that both theological blood work to secure the pure community and bios, or biology-based blood work to secure the community, also secure the community, employ sacrifice or logics of death, logics of atonement, so to speak, in the attempt to consolidate the pure community, that is, the nation, upon the foundations of a singular and sacrosanct identity. A singular and sacrosanct identity. Hence, there can be no biopolitics without its corresponding necropolitics. The question is, who gets aligned with death and who with life? In necropolitics, in the High Middle Ages, blood did theopolitical work in consolidating the community and determining who's in and who's outside of the community. In this regard, I'm thinking of the links between soteriological and atonement discourses in the High Middle Ages and the concurrent cultural practices of Christian crusading intent on securing a pure Christendom. And now, in the modern era, in the modern age of the biopolitical, blood still does theopolitical work, but in the mode of racial governance and in the production of the racial state that's invested in purity, or ontopolitical, or an ontopolitical theology of pure being. Racial governance names the procedures of the constitution and regulation of civil society, and more broadly, the shape of the political and even the international as such, the shape that is of sovereignty or self-determination aimed at purity. In the interval of a conversion from the medieval to the modern, that is, in the moment of the congealing of our medieval modernity, the Semite, as a newly invented race type, was born. Or, to put matters differently still, anti-Jewishness, or anti-Judaism, or anti-Judaica. I hope this constellation of terms starts to get at communicate to you what I'm getting at, metamorphosed into anti-Semitism. The Semitic, what I'm trying to say, is a race category. It has a particular moment of production. I'm trying to target that moment of production and pull certain claims out of it. A new species, the Semite is a new species. The new species was born, the Semite, as a negative biotheological figure in relationship to another species that was born in this moment, another biotheological figure, namely the European as white. Herein is the birth of whiteness, even if in this moment the lexical vocabulary was not in place. Given this, there's nothing natural, biological or otherwise, about the Semite as such, or in its split racial identity about the Jew / the Muslim, or the Jew / the Arab. Gil Anijar, again, I contend, is right on this point. But here's the next point, and I contend the most important if we're to understand the racial world, the production of the Semite, and what it means to target the problem of anti-Semitism. As an internally and racially split figure, the Semite came into being, but only in relationship to another normalizing figure, only in relationship to a figure of the normal, a regulative and regulating figure. This is the figure of the sovereign, or he who carries out the work of sovereignty, which is to say, the work of rule, and indeed of mastery, self-mastery, whose pure being, that is to say universality, coincides with such concepts as democracy, free markets, and freedom itself. In the work that I'm in the final stages of finishing, I demarcate him, this figure, yes, him, because the sovereign is patriarchal. The sovereign is a kind of heterosexually normative patriarchal figurine of the masculine. I demarcate him as a quote-unquote God-man. Indeed, as an imperial God-man, whose soteriological work is to secure life by being the executioner of death, or that which signifies impure being. W.E.B. Du Bois in the 20th century saw this God-man figure as he who anchors what he called, in the wake of World War I and the rise of the Treaty of Versailles, the religion of whiteness on the shores of our times. And yet, insofar as the modern world emerges precisely as a process of racialization intent on the total regulation of life against any and all forms of death threats, modernity's ideal man, capital M, as a God-man figure operates under the more secular or humanistic name of the human. Though the human and the ontology this figure, the human, indexes as human being, emerges as always already overrepresented and overdetermined by the European/Western man, racially known in terms of whiteness, that is, as the white masculine, as the sovereign. What I'm trying to press is to think the relationship between the production of the white, the production and the birth of the Semite, and thereby anti-Semitism, and that these two ought not be collapsed into each other. They're produced, right, contrapuntally in relationship to each other. The non-white emerges on the scene of the modern in relationship to the Western European subject, and if the subaltern is to be recognized as properly human, what Gayatri Spivak says, if the subaltern is to, as it were, speak, he must aspire toward and imitate this God-man, aspire towards the normal, imitate democracy, be for markets, be for freedom. In acts of imitatio Christi, the imitation of this figure of the human, she or he must aspire toward the normal, towards democracy, freedom, and the like. Non-whiteness then is set up due to its supposed deficiency. It's set up due to its supposed deficiency, lacking autonomy, lacking transparency, lacking universality, mired in its own particularity, even its religious particularity, to aspire towards the universal, towards being like man. This will be a vital point as I move further in the presentation and this argument, but for now, it's important that I make sure that I'm clear about the process that I'm describing here. I've been describing not a biological process. Race is not about biology, though many of us here, I would presume most of us here, have already conceded to pushing away from essentialisms. I'm describing the process of a political formation. Racism is a political formation. I'm describing a process of political formation, the formation that is the process of Europeanization, now Euro-Americanization, or we might just simply say Westernization. I'm describing race ism as central to the apparatus of Euro-Americanization, which is to say, to colonial sovereignty or to autonomy as self-determining rule based on pure being, the securing of purity, and based on the refusal of cultural intimacies and contact. This means that neither the Semite nor the white comes first. They are contiguous. Neither the non-white nor the white comes first. They are contiguous. Modernity emerges and modern racial subjects emerge through a process of dehiscence. This term I take from Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon talks about this process in Black Skin, White Masks in talking about what he calls the lived experience of the black. These are a set of experiences, the experiences of blackness that in relationship to the political coordinates of normativity are the domain of what's real, can only appear, the experience of the black against this backdrop can only appear as always already pathological, as madness, or in defiance of what's rational. It becomes a signifying trait. Rational is a signifying trait of the universal sovereign subject of Western man. Blackness appears as the antithesis of this, as the disorder of positive value. And finally, can only appear, talking about the lived experience of the black, can only appear as having already been criminalized, and therefore as a troubling of and the trouble with, the trembling within the regimes of sovereignty, a disturbance of the nation state. If the poet Nathaniel Mackey would speak of what I'm describing, drawing on Fanon himself as the natal occasion of blackness, I'm now pressing it into the service of understanding what happened to Jewishness, Jewish identity, in its supersessionistic production as Semite, as the negative racial other at the dawning of the modern age, as a kind of index of a death horizon in relationship to the production of whiteness and Europeanness. What is the natality of blackness? I'm also asking inside of this, what is the natality of the Semite? What is the natality of blackness? And what might it mean to think the natality, the birthing of Jewish identity next to Arab identity as jointly invented as Semite right next to blackness? What does it mean to think Semitism next to blackness and to read them next to each other as jointly produced in relationship to whiteness? And why not think these together? The Jew, the black, inasmuch as they are born in relationship to a purported transparent whiteness, a transparency and universality that whiteness, a transparency and universality, I was typing fast here, that whiteness from, what was I trying to say? A transparency and universality that culminates in the figure of man, the human. Fred Moulton puts words to the natal occasion of blackness. He tells us, blackness indexes an irremediable homelessness common to the colonized, the enslaved, the enclosed, the despised. This is to say that what is claimed in the name blackness is an undercommon disorder, the disorder of the undercommons that has always been there, that is retrospectively and retroactively located there, that is embraced by the ones who stay there while living somewhere else. Some folks relish being a problem. As Amiri Baraka and Nikhil Pal Singh almost say, blackness is itself a country, an insovereign country. That's where I'm trying to get. Stay with me. Blackness is a country, an insovereign country, and a sex that is not one. Stolen life disorders the positive value of sovereignty understood as a project of race and nation, a project of the racial state in the name of insovereignty, just as surely as blackness is not equivalent to social death or absolute dereliction, end quote. Blackness, therefore, is underground contact, the contact of the undercommons, not just the contact of the commons or the proletariat, as Marx might have it. I'm trying to remix Marx, sample from him if I may. This is the contact underneath the commons, the undercommons contact of intimacy. Blackness is what took place in the hull of slave ships when people from across the African continent were thrown together by Europeans and had to invent meaning, invent language together. Blackness, therefore, is life, a mode of life in the midst of an immolation that sought to consume them but did not consume them. It is a mode of life irreducible to sovereignty and the life-death political ontology and calculus. It is, shall we say, para-ontological life, life that doesn't ground or secure itself through the death of another, life that doesn't ground or secure itself through the death of another, that doesn't have the fear of the other as the horizon of its own being and against which it must fight. Blackness then is sociality without exclusion. It is sociality in excess of the life-death binary in which some are aligned with life and others are aligned with death as threats to the nation state. Blackness is life beyond the mandate of borders and boundaries. And in this sense, blackness is para-ontological to the extent that it is insovereign, to the extent that its socio-political investments resist the mandate to be sovereign. Blackness refuses the meaning of purity and stability that colonial sovereignty assigns to it. I'm not making a totalizing claim about black people. How could I? I'm just one black man. That was supposed to be funny, but okay. I know it's the end of the day, but y'all gotta loosen up. I'm not making a totalizing claim about black people. How could I? As if blackness and black people are equivalent. No, blackness is fugitive from even black people. It indexes modes of life not predicated on sovereignty. And when black people try to claim sovereignty, it's a problem. Sovereignty has been invested in the purity of the people, which is precisely what fugitive blackness is not invested in. The question I pose, therefore, for us in this specific context is this: can or ought or how might this be said perhaps about Jewishness? To what extent is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or Israel's latest offensive into Gaza an exemplification by way of settler colonialism of precisely the racial sovereignty that I'm trying to trouble here and describe here, and that I've claimed here is part of a project of purity, racial purity, of pure human being and thus of pure political being? What does the statement, the right to exist as a Jewish state, mean given the longue durée of colonial sovereignty that I've just sketched? I want to situate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the lines of this analysis, the analysis I've begun to set out here, and that appears more fully developed in the book that I'm developing under the context and the concept of the color of sovereignty. And I want to imagine lines of flight, to speak in a perhaps Deleuzian way, from the vantage point of a fugitive history of political theology, which is the unthought history I want to claim, the unthought history of the Palestinian conflict. It is a reading of that conflict that I want to suggest that is in keeping with the loaded and weighty terms and words coming from Caiaphas's lips, we heard of Caiaphas earlier today, at the approaching of the Passover of the Jews as recorded in the fourth evangel. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, I'm reading this as a statement of political theology, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one person should die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish, end quote. I'm interested then in atonement, not just as a theological category, but as a concept of cultural production, as a framework through which to understand the production of negative racial subjects, such as the Semites, such as the black, as those who must die and be dispossessed in order for the life of another subject, the white, the European, to possess, to be self-determinative. Thus, I propose a turn to blackness, to the enslaved, to those shipped and cargoed, made to be cargo, as a fugitive vector from which to think in sovereignty, or the problem of sovereignty in Palestine. And by think the problem of sovereignty and the prospect of insovereignty in Palestine, I do not mean to solve the problem of sovereignty in Palestine. I mean something along the lines of what Aimé Césaire was getting at when in his poem, Lagunal Calendar, he says, I inhabit a sacred wound. Pause. The wound is what I've been trying to describe. I inhabit a sacred wound. A long silence is my dwelling place. I inhabit a 300-year war. And if I may speak back to Césaire and extend his insovereign poetics, I would extend it this way. Can silence speak? Sovereign prose, interrupted, paratheological whispers, refused, evaporating sounds of death in Palestine, immolated possibilities of an othered sociality otherwise. I'm interested in an othered sociality otherwise. The Caesarean task is to begin to construct a contrapuntal reading of the production, indeed, of the conditions of the production of present-day Palestine, of Palestinian resistance next to Israeli claims of a right to exist, and the key phrase for me in this, as a Jewish state. What has been banished to the zone of silence, but yet conditions the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And how does that which is silenced and that in that silence animates the conflict, how does it relate to anti-Semitism? How must our understanding of anti-Semitism then be altered if we read it against the long history of coloniality, as Césaire has put it, against the backdrop of a very long war? The war that Foucault, I think, was trying to get at in his 75, 76 lectures, Society Must Be Defended, and he called race war. I propose then a third social coordinate of entry into the fraught area of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the silent spaces of negritude or blackness. The task is to inhabit this impasse, the impossible and deathly passage of sovereignty under the regulatory regime of the sovereign. Okay, I've lost track of time. What am I looking like? Okay. I'll summarize then the next two movements. In a certain sense, what I've given you here is a real condensed expression of the total itinerary of the argument. In the second movement that I have laid out here, I call the effort towards a kind of post-colonial Jewishness. And in this section, basically, I develop an argument about the way in which I historicize the formation and the development and the implantation of European Jews into Palestine in the Middle East. I pay particular attention to the place of what happened post-World War I, in the ways in which the British post-World War I and during World War I got involved in the Middle East and in Palestine, how they laid claim, established a British mandate over areas and sections of Palestine, and eventually and in effect made Palestine an outpost of British colonial power. I then moved to World War II and elaborate the ways in which, led again by the British, Europe carved out, led by the British, carved out a space for a contemporary modern nation state of Israel in Palestine as a way, in one sense, to alleviate and respond to the problem of Hitler and the way in which Auschwitz worked, but at the same time to refuse to create a space, a mode, a place of existence and in flourishing for European Jews in Europe itself. In other words, the making of the modern nation state of Israel was a kind of convenient production for Europeans who refused to make a space for Jews in Europe itself. So in a certain sense, they affected what I say somewhat playfully, but I do mean it intentionally, they affected the first two-state solution, so to speak. Rather than taking in and being providing a space of intimacy and cultural contact for Jews in Europe, they outposted it into Palestine. I playfully call this a kind of two-state solution already as a part of dealing with what happened in Europe, culminating in Auschwitz. From there, I then elaborate the ways in which European Jews go into Palestine and the ways in which they repeat practices of dispossession among the indigenous people there, Palestinians, who, by the way, had cities and so on and so forth, and vibrant expressions of life, trade, etc., etc. The point of my analysis is not to say who's right and who's wrong. The point is to take a kind of genealogical step back and analyze the conditions of its own production and link it back to European conquest and colonialism itself, and name the production of what's going on in Palestine as a kind of reproduction of coloniality. That's the second movement. The final movement of the paper, which I surely wouldn't get a chance to get to, is to come back to Aimé Césaire and his notion of negritude and read it as a political concept. His effort to think blackness not as the cultural property of black people and therefore as a mode of pure racial being owned by blacks, but instead to think blackness as always already open and in contact with another. And to try from there to think new political arrangements back in Europe. In his case, he was a politician in France and tried to move the French towards federalized modes of governance that would have the once colonized equal partners in the governmental structures of France and thereby revolutionize French existence and expand what negritude itself is about. And so what I'm trying to propose then is a mode of identity that is trying to escape the logics of pure being that were put in place back in the dawning moments of colonial conquest, slavery, and so on and so forth. So I just gave you a very quick reading of what I'm trying to do in this project. And again, I want to make it very clear, this argument is from the space of being against anti-Semitism. But if we're against anti-Semitism as the kind of enforced negative purity upon the Semite in the name of a whiteness, the question becomes, what shall Jewishness become? Just like black folk have had to ask, what shall blackness become if the project of pure being has always been to our detriment? Thank you.
We'll go a few minutes over and have a question or two. Yeah.
I'll take the prerogative and ask the first question here. So first of all, thank you all, and thank you to everyone for a really very stimulating day. So this will start as a question to Sarah, but really then kind of, in a way, it's also a question to Ward and possibly also a question to Jay. So I was very intrigued by the project of trying to think through the link between Badiou and the Days of Rage, the Jours de Colère. And it strikes me that Badiou's Paulinism has him supposedly opposing all particularisms, which for him, I think, in this context, really means nationalisms. And so he's opposed to Jewish nationalism, to Zionism, obviously. But he's also opposed to French nationalism, and I think you pointed to that in his, which he refers to all French nationalism as Vichy in a way, so it becomes, Nazified. And I think he's also therefore opposed to Republican universalism, so to the other instantiation of universalism in France right now, which is the Republican form, which I think he also associates with French nationalism. So the participants in the Days of Rage also oppose those two nationalisms, it strikes me, the Jewish one and the French one. But they're very explicitly not opposed to Arab or Palestinian nationalism. In fact, much of what they're doing, it strikes me, is in the name of a kind of Arab or Palestinian nationalism, at least for some of them. And so I guess my question is, for Ward too, how Badiou deals with that contradiction. With, is he, for him, I think, the Palestinians are the oppressed, basically. They're the underclass too, they've taken the place of the proletariat in his, cosmology, I think. But how he gets around the problem of advocating for essentially another kind of nationalism. Now, he, and this I think gets to Jay, which is I think my problem with a lot of people who support the one-state solution, which in theory sounds great, it's anti-nationalist. But, if you start to think about any concrete, real manifestation of what it would look like going forward, it would be Arab or Palestinian nationalist. That's what it seems like would be the result of it. So it's hard for me to get towards supporting that just in a real world kind of sense. But I'm wondering how, if you've seen where Badiou takes on that question.
I like your question, and it's really helpful for me. I guess I would tend to rephrase what I find is problematic about Badiou, not in terms of supporting Palestinian nationalism, but in terms of advocating a kind of political action which one would assume if it were revolutionary would have to involve some sort of concrete result. And how would that concrete result not replicate the form that he's supposedly protesting? And that is particularly what I find so problematic about the form of politics. I'm sorry, is this not on? Oh, I don't know how to turn it on. It says it's on. It says on, but I don't know if it's really on. Yeah, so I guess I would rephrase what you're saying is, if you have a form of politics which has to do with enacting change, and if that is modeled on ideas of revolution and militancy, what do you do when you have to actually reinstate anything, right? And how does instatement not follow? So I guess all I can really do is sort of replicate your question back in a sort of more general form. I mean, I guess what I would say about Jour de Colère is that my sense of it is that it's successful insofar as it was successful insofar as it managed to conform a left and a right anger, but that in fact many of the sort of organizing factions are in fact still on the right and not actually coming from Islamic frustrations in France. But actually, I mean, what's been successful is that somebody like Dieudonné has followers who are on both sides. And I guess what was interesting to me is that the form of having to reject partisanship, that's shared for Badiou and for this new sort of form of manifestation. And what I think is troubling about that is that it's change, but it doesn't seem to be, there's this sort of desire to eradicate or to efface the kinds of important historical distinctions that shouldn't be eradicated. And that strikes me as where you can see danger on both sides. And that's what I was really trying to say. So,
I mean, just to add quickly, I think it's a very interesting question about Badiou and the contradictions, as you say, in his work. And they are contradictions. And I think, I would want to add that very strongly, actually. That there are multiple Badious, just as there are multiple Levinases. And I'm not sure that in this sense Badiou is stir the pot a tiny bit, like more problematic than some of the things Levinas is up to as well. And if one would have to sort of work with Badiou and also against him, then why would that be a big surprise for any of us? I mean, caught as we all are in all kinds of contradictions about place and generality and so on. I think for that reason, that's why I'm so interested in repetition compulsion. And this is why I think Freud's such a key figure for our discussions, because in some ways for me, one of the most essential questions for Freud is why is it that, like, despite the fact that something's not necessary, certain repetitions in cultural formations, they come back as if there's no way to get around them, a kind of destiny. And that's what I find most interesting, and I think here I agree completely with what Sarah has been saying. But in Badiou, there is a sense in which his Paul doesn't need to underwrite any of the kind of, triumphalist European stuff, and yet it keeps coming back. And why is that? And I don't think there's a good answer, but that's why I'm interested in sort of almost the mystery of repetition compulsion, and not a great answer, but it's there.
I guess that I'd want to ask maybe for further clarification on why you suppose that a one-state solution would somewhat necessarily entail a kind of would in effect, which would be like a kind of Arab nationalism. Because the reason I ask that question is because in a certain sense, what I'm trying to actually argue against now is what I think is happening now, namely an Israeli nationalism. And my critique of nationalism is that every nationalism needs its death-bound subject. And the Palestinians are in effect being perceived as constant threat to the purity of the nation state that gets encoded in this term, a right to exist as a Jewish state. And so I am calling for a one-state solution, but I'm not calling for a one-nation-state solution. I'm calling for something, a political formation that exceeds the practices of statehood and statecraft as we've seen them instantiated in modernity, which have been nation-state / projects of purity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I understand that, and I totally get why, in theory and to theorists, nationalism is bad and we shouldn't support it in any way, and that sovereignty is bad, and these things. But it just strikes me that, except for theorists, and they're few, most of the people who are on the ground there don't really want that. And so in like a real world situation where there would be, one state, it wouldn't be this kind of nice, unsovereign thing. I think it would kind of lead to some bad stuff going on. And, I think most people would say it would be, a majority Palestinian state, and that would lead to some bad consequences for Jews. And given that, the kind of history that has led up to the creation of the Jewish state, that's why I can't go there, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could maybe just retort back and say, well, some pretty bad stuff happening right now, right? And so I think the other thing, if I were to sort of give a longer kind of account of the formation of the racial world in relationship to coloniality and so on and so forth, one of the principal things that it does is it atrophies the imagination with respect to the possible. And so I am trying to argue that there may be sort of, to inflect maybe, Levinas in a certain way, I'm trying to sort of inflect an otherwise than being, or maybe beyond Levinas, Ernst Bloch. I'm trying to think the utopic possible. And I think that what I'm getting after is, it seems to me that there should be nothing in practice, let alone theory, that prevents the emergence of some sort of political arrangement in which the demands of a nation of purity is the kind of driving, motivating force, the kind of the theological, the political kind of technology that sort of guides the production of the nation. If we took that off the table, I'm trying to imagine, why can't we imagine a kind of intimacy and contact between Palestinians and Jews? May I ask, just interject one more final thing. One of the reasons I try to dial this back and not go right to the conflict and to go to its genealogical conditions of production and link it to coloniality, because part of what I was trying to say in setting up the kind of colonial genealogical backdrop is that the production of anti-Semitism in relationship to the production of blackness, in relationship to the supremacy of whiteness, is all predicated on the refusal of contact. The modern world is produced in the refusal of contact. And so another name for Christian supersessionism is the refusal of cultural intimacy, the refusal of touch and contact, which is why the slave ship becomes so interesting to me, because it's precisely the place where people who are thrown together without linguistic contact, without all manner of other cosmological similarities are thrown together, and they touch, they make meaning, and a mode of life happens submarine-like in the hull of the slave ship. What if that became a kind of modality of thought for the political?
Last thing, because I can't help myself, because I totally get, why in theory, that's desirable. But I guess my sticking point is why Israel is always the first country that's being asked to give up its national sovereignty. Given that it's the one Jewish country. There are lots of Islamic countries that, but it's the one country that's always supposed to be the first one to give up its nationalism, and that strikes me as problematic.
How late do you want to go? Please come to the...
I only came midway through the session, so I'm sorry I really wanted to hear Sarah Hammerschlag's paper, but I was tied up in meetings, so I'm sorry. But my name's Ellie Stern. I teach here. I have a question, though, for the last paper. 2 questions. The first is the identification of colonialism with Christianity. I want to perhaps provocatively push it a little bit further. Most of the research that we've seen now on the origins of Christianity has shown just how intimately tied together it is with what we call Judaism. Mm-hmm. Certainly its imperialist, universal ideals are things that really come out of a certain Judeo ideals. So would we push this further and say that you're not only anti-Semitism, but also anti-Judaism? In other words, would we also say that you're against Judaism to the extent that Judaism is also implicated in this colonialization project? Now, depending upon where you want to date the beginning of that colonialization project, if you do it with Christianity, certainly those ideas are Jewish ones. Certainly they are messianic. So would you also be promoting anti-Judaism in your talk? That's the first question. The second question here deals with a little bit of the issue of agency in the way you're describing Zionism. The description of Zionism, the description of the Jew that you have in the modern period is one totally devoid of all agency. Where's the agency of the Jew in modernity here? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the history, certainly that argument that you're making is an argument that Herzl makes. Certainly Herzl does make a very similar argument that this is Europe's problem. But if you actually look at the history of Zionism and where it comes from, as Herzl himself admits, I never would have said anything I say. I never would have had to even write this tract had I known what was going on in Eastern Europe. The whole history of Eastern European Jewry doesn't even use a signifier, if we're talking the level of discourse, of anti-Semitism. It uses the signifier of the Žid, of the Jew, and of Judaism. That history has to do with the way in which actually out of Marxism and the spreading of Marxist socialist ideals, that Jews themselves came to the idea that they were a distinct historical people. Now, Jews who were from Eastern Europe were actually not able ever, for 200 years, were not able to travel to Palestine. The borders were actually sealed off for them. They certainly couldn't walk even into Jerusalem. There was a loan on a standing institution in Jerusalem in which Ashkenazic Jews were not even allowed to enter, to be able to say that, yes, this is a place that they feel comfortable in or that they would like to reside in. There were actually real problems with immigration there. So if I'm looking at the history of Zionism, I'm not even thinking about anti-Semitism. I'm trying to understand the agency of the Jew in the modern period and the idea that Jews saw themselves as having a claim to that land historically, and it was only because of immigration laws that they were unable to actually go there. So where's the agency of the Jew in your story?
I don't think that first of all, I'm not trying to give a totalizing history. I'm giving a genealogy. And I'm giving a genealogy of a particular kind of phenomenon.
So I'm giving a genealogy too. That's what I'm saying. I'm giving a genealogy also.
I get all that. All I'm trying to do on one level is, I forget, you're going to have to remind me of your first question, but to stay with the second one is insofar as I understand it. The point of the second move is not to strip anyone of agency. It's to highlight, right? In making the kind of highlighting of the operations of a kind of certain Europeanization, right, that would extend itself globally, that would make itself a will towards a kind of planetary consciousness that goes back, as I said, at least as far as the 15th century. I isolated that moment because the will towards planetary consciousness coincides with the production of a racial imaginary. We can go back if we wanted to talk about other things, but the production of a racial imaginary has a distinct moment of origin. So I'm trying to think that moment and think about its ripples throughout and ripples forward from there. None of that is to say that any particular Jewish constituency didn't have agency. I'm trying to highlight its relationship to a particular agency of domination, a particular agency of Europeanization. And it's only insofar as that I'm highlighting that. The second thing I'm doing is I want to think I don't think anything that I said in the talk mitigates against Jewish claims, as you've summarized in the framing of your question, coming out of Eastern Europe, Jewish claims towards a homeland in Palestine. None of that is going on. That ain't even what I'm targeting. What I'm trying to get after is the ways in which moving into a certain place almost necessitates the dispossessing of others there, rather than thinking through what some kind of cohabitation might mean. We might not like the fact, but it is a fact, there were people there. Just like when Columbus came to the Antilles, there were people there. Those people were dispossessed. The possibility of contact, cultural intimacy, a non-death life relationship was not in the offing. And I'm trying to track the ways in which that continues to shape this thing we call modernity and how anti-Semitism is related to that.
We're quite a bit over time, so I'm going to need to jump in here.
And then I just wanted to know, I just wanted to get a clear sense of the first question. Would you also say, though, that this is also, that you're also speaking against anti-Judaism in the sense that the supersessionist, certainly universal, conquering and colonialist ambitions of Christianity are also very much linked to Isaiah and Judaism to that extent?
In the interest of time, I'll make a very brief answer, and maybe we can talk face-to-face afterwards. My very brief and direct answer is no. Nothing that I say commits me to that. In fact, again, to stay very brief, I'm invested, insofar as I want to think now strictly as a Christian theologian, I'm invested in the problem by which Christian Gentiles came to think of themselves as intelligible apart from their relatedness to the Jewish faith, to Judaism. And to the extent that Christian supersessionism is the breaking off from, the splintering of Gentiles off from the life, the realities of Judaism, to that extent, I'm also therefore committed constructively then towards Christians understanding themselves necessarily as internal to the reality of Judaism. So I hope anything that I've said actually turns towards and is an attempt to mend the breach initiated by Gentiles, Gentile Christians, by which they slice themselves off independently and try to imagine themselves as intelligible apart from Judaism.
Thank you very much. Let's thank all three of our speakers.
And actually, let's thank all of our speakers here today and the audience for sticking with the long and, but I think very, very enriching day. And I invite everybody to join us for a reception in the room straight back there. So thank you to everybody.